You ever wonder how much of the world around us is actually real, and how much of it is engineered? Like, how many events we think were random twists of history were actually someone's carefully planned move, executed so quietly we never saw the strings. That's what tonight's talk is about. This isn't a movie plot. This is the real story of how the CIA, an agency born out of fear, grew into one of the most powerful manipulative forces in the modern world. It all starts in 1947. World War II is over. The US and Soviet Union are sizing each other up across Europe. Everyone's terrified of a third world war. But this time, it's not going to be fought with tanks and trenches. It's going to be fought in the shadows. The US government knew they couldn't win that kind of war with the regular military. They needed something different. A group that could infiltrate, subvert, influence, and, if necessary, destroy. All without fingerprints. That's why President Truman signed the National Security Act. And just like that, the Central Intelligence Agency was born. At first, the CIA's mission sounded simple: collect foreign intelligence and keep the president informed. But the people running it quickly realized that just knowing things wasn't enough. What good is information if you can't use it to shape events? And so the agency evolved. They started influencing elections, staging coups, toppling governments, and planting stories, all while staying invisible. They weren't just watching history anymore. They were writing it. One of their earliest projects set the tone for everything that followed. It was called Operation Paperclip, and it wasn't about coups or assassinations, it was about brains. After W-Coup, the CIA and its predecessor, the OSS, quietly brought over more than 1,600 German scientists, many of them former Nazis, to work on American weapons, rockets, and intelligence programs. These weren't just scientists. Some had run horrific experiments in concentration camps. But Washington didn't care. If their knowledge could help America beat the Soviets, ethics could wait. Then came the first taste of political manipulation. In 1948, Italy's elections looked like they might swing communist. The CIA couldn't let that happen. They funneled millions of dollars to opposition parties, ran massive propaganda campaigns, and even forged letters to smear communist leaders. It worked. The pro-American party won, and the CIA learned a crucial lesson. You don't have to invade a country to control it. You just have to control the story. By the early 1950s, they were ready for something bigger. The target, Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister, decided that Iran's oil should benefit Iranians, not British and American corporations. That made him an enemy. So, the CIA launched Operation Ajax. They paid mobs to riot in Tehran. They bribed officials. They spread propaganda calling Mossadegh a communist puppet. Within weeks, the streets were chaos, the government collapsed, and the Shah, a pro-US monarch, was back in power. It was a textbook coup. It was also the start of decades of resentment that would explode in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the US Embassy hostage crisis. The blowback would haunt America for generations. But in 1953, the CIA called it a victory. The next year, they tried it again in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz wanted to redistribute unused land owned by the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation. That was enough for the US to brand him a communist. The CIA launched Operation PB Success, training a rebel army, staging a fake revolution, and bombarding the country with psychological warfare, including fake radio broadcasts reporting imaginary victories. Arbenz fled. A brutal dictatorship took power, and Guatemala fell into decades of civil war and genocide. But hey, United Fruit kept its land. The success of these operations made the CIA hungry for more. They started believing they could engineer the world like a chessboard. But not everything went according to plan. In 1961, they set their sights on Cuba. Fidel Castro had overthrown a US-backed dictator and aligned himself with Moscow. The CIA thought they could fix that. They trained 1,400 Cuban exiles, armed them, and sent them to invade the island at a place called the Bay of Pigs. They expected the Cuban people to rise up. They didn't. Castro's forces crushed the invasion in 3 days. It was a disaster. one so humiliating that it nearly triggered World War III. The failure pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and a year later, Soviet missiles were stationed just 90 miles from Florida, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. But if coups and invasions could backfire, the CIA had another card up its sleeve: psychological warfare. Not on enemies, but on people. And this is where things get truly disturbing. Starting in the early 1950s, the CIA launched Project MK-Ultra, a series of secret experiments aimed at discovering how to control the human mind. They believed the Soviets were brainwashing prisoners, so they wanted to develop their own techniques. The experiments were brutal and illegal. They dosed prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even random civilians with LSD, often without their knowledge or consent. They tried hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy. They even built brothels in San Francisco, where unsuspecting men were drugged and observed behind one-way mirrors. The goal was simple: see if a mind could be broken and rebuilt to create a perfect spy, a perfect assassin, or a perfect puppet. The results were chaotic. Some people suffered permanent psychological damage. At least one, Frank Olson, a CIA scientist unknowingly dosed with LSD, fell or was pushed from a hotel window. The official story said suicide. His family believed otherwise. Most MK-Ultra documents were destroyed in 1973 when the program was exposed. But the fragments that survived reveal a chilling truth. The CIA didn't just want to manipulate governments. They wanted to manipulate people. They also turned their attention to information itself. With Operation Mockingbird, the CIA infiltrated the media. They recruited journalists, funded newspapers, and influenced stories to promote U.S. interests and discredit enemies. Some reporters worked directly with the agency, submitting articles for approval. Others were unwittingly fed false information. The result was a media landscape that often served as an extension of U.S. foreign policy, shaping public opinion both abroad and at home. By the mid-1950s, espionage itself was evolving. It wasn't enough to plant stories or overthrow governments. The CIA wanted real-time intelligence. That led to operations like Operation Gold, where they dug a tunnel from West Berlin into the Soviet sector to tap into Russian communication lines. It was an engineering marvel and a complete failure. A British mole named George Blake had already told the Soviets about the plan, and they used it to feed disinformation. Still, it showed how far the CIA would go for an edge. The agency also began pushing the boundaries of technology. They developed the U-2 spy plane, capable of flying higher than any Soviet missile could reach, snapping photos of secret installations deep inside the USSR. But in 1960, one of those planes was shot down, and the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. The incident embarrassed Washington and exposed the CIA's covert surveillance program to the world. Despite these setbacks, the agency's reach was expanding rapidly. By the early 1960s, they were running operations in more than 50 countries. They were training guerrilla fighters, funding anti-communist militias, sabotaging infrastructure, and manipulating elections from Latin America to Southeast Asia. They had become, in effect, a global shadow government, one that operated without accountability and often without the knowledge of the very officials it was supposed to serve. And then came Vietnam. The Vietnam War would change the CIA forever. At first, their role was small, gathering intelligence, training local forces, but as the conflict escalated, so did their involvement. They launched Operation Phoenix, a campaign aimed at dismantling the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. On paper, it was a counterinsurgency program. In reality, it was a campaign of assassinations, kidnappings, and torture. Over 20,000 people were killed, many with no evidence linking them to the Viet Cong. Villages were terrorized. Innocent people disappeared, and the agency justified it all as necessary to win hearts and minds. By the time the 1960s drew to a close, the CIA had transformed from a fledgling spy agency into something far more powerful and far more dangerous. They had toppled governments, manipulated media, experimented on civilians, and shaped the course of global politics, all without a single vote cast in their favor. They weren't just a part of U.S. foreign policy anymore. They were foreign policy, and this was just the beginning. Because if the first 2 decades of the CIA's history were about building power, the next 2 would be about wielding it, often with catastrophic consequences. By the mid-1960s, the CIA was no longer a young agency trying to prove itself. It was the most powerful intelligence service on Earth. Presidents trusted it more than their own diplomats. Generals needed its information before they made a single move. Congress barely understood what it was doing. And across the planet, nations were learning one hard lesson. If Washington didn't like your government, the CIA was coming for you. One of the most chilling examples came in Congo. In 1960, the young nation had just thrown off Belgian colonial rule and elected Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic, Pan-African leader who wanted to keep Congo independent from both East and West. The U.S. saw him as a potential Soviet ally. President Eisenhower reportedly told CIA Director Allen Dulles that Lumumba had to be eliminated. What followed was a tangle of covert plans: poison toothpaste, assassins, coup plots. Eventually, Lumumba was captured by rivals backed by the West and executed. His death plunged Congo into decades of chaos, all because one man refused to take sides. The agency's obsession with regime change didn't stop there. In Chile, the people elected a Marxist president, Salvador Allende, in 1970. The White House wasn't having it. President Nixon ordered the CIA to make the economy scream. Millions of dollars poured into opposition groups, strikes were organized, and media outlets blasted anti-Allende propaganda. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military, emboldened and supported by CIA backing, overthrew the government. Allende died in the presidential palace. General Augusto Pinochet's brutal dictatorship would torture and kill thousands. Washington called it a victory for freedom. Chileans called it a nightmare. Meanwhile, the CIA was experimenting with new ways to fight wars, ones where they never had to fire a shot themselves. This era birthed the concept of the proxy war. Arm someone else, fund someone else, train someone else, and let them fight the enemy for you. It was clean, cheap, and, most importantly, deniable. One of the most infamous examples of this strategy was Operation Chaos. The Vietnam War was tearing America apart. Protests erupted in every major city. Young people burned draft cards. Civil rights leaders spoke out. The government was terrified that communist powers might be behind the unrest. So, the CIA turned its gaze inward, even though it was forbidden from spying on Americans. They opened mail, tapped phones, infiltrated anti-war groups, and built massive databases on activists. None of it found evidence of foreign control, but it revealed a darker truth. Once the CIA had power, even the American people weren't off limits. Outside U.S. borders, the agency's reach was growing deadlier. One of their most controversial programs was Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. It was designed to dismantle the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. But in reality, it became a campaign of terror. Intelligence officers identified suspected communists, many based on flimsy evidence, and paramilitary units were sent to neutralize them. Over 20,000 people were killed. Some executed in their homes, others disappeared without a trace. Villages lived in fear of night raids and torture. Officially, it was a success. In reality, it blurred the line between counterinsurgency and war crimes. And then there were the assassinations, or as the CIA liked to call them, executive actions. The agency tried to kill Fidel Castro over 600 times. They poisoned cigars, rigged seashells with explosives, and even recruited mobsters to take him out. They plotted to assassinate other leaders too, from Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic to Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. Some succeeded, some failed, but all revealed the same unsettling fact. The CIA was playing God with global politics. But sometimes the agency's operations didn't involve violence at all. Sometimes they were psychological, subtle, sophisticated, and devastating. Enter the world of propaganda warfare. Through programs like Operation Mockingbird, the CIA planted stories in newspapers around the world, shaped coverage of key events, and spread disinformation to manipulate public opinion. In Italy, they created fake communist scandals. In Latin America, they produced forged Soviet documents. In Europe, they backed independent radio stations that just happened to push pro-American narratives. It wasn't about telling the truth, it was about shaping reality. One of the most ambitious propaganda campaigns was aimed at Eastern Europe during the Cold War. The CIA secretly funded cultural magazines, art exhibitions, even jazz tours, all designed to portray the United States as the beacon of freedom and the Soviet Union as backward and oppressive. They understood something most people didn't. Wars aren't just fought with bombs. They're fought with stories. But for all their successes, the CIA also faced spectacular failures, some of which nearly brought the world to the brink. One of the most dramatic was the U-2 incident. In 1960, a high-altitude U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory. The U.S. initially denied everything, claiming it was a weather aircraft. But the Soviets had the wreckage, and Powers alive. The incident humiliated Washington and shattered a major diplomatic summit. It also exposed the CIA's deep cover reconnaissance operations to the world. Despite the embarrassment, the U-2 program paved the way for even bolder projects. In 1962, the CIA launched Corona, the world's first successful spy satellite program. Tiny film capsules packed with images of Soviet missile sites were dropped from space and snagged mid-air by specially equipped aircraft. It was a technological marvel, and it gave Washington the edge it needed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the 1970s, however, the CIA was starting to lose its cloak of invisibility. The Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and leaks about MKUltra and domestic spying eroded public trust. In 1975, the U.S. Senate formed the Church Committee to investigate the intelligence community. What they found shocked the nation. Plots to assassinate foreign leaders, experiments on American citizens, illegal surveillance, and a level of secrecy that even presidents didn't fully understand. The fallout was huge. New oversight committees were formed. Executive orders banned assassinations. Laws were passed to limit domestic spying. But the reforms didn't weaken the CIA. They forced it to evolve. And in the 1980s, under the leadership of Director William Casey and President Ronald Reagan, the agency would enter one of its most active and controversial eras. One of the defining moments of that decade was the CIA's role in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded to prop up a communist government. The U.S. saw an opportunity. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA funneled billions of dollars in weapons and training to Afghan Mujahideen fighters. They supplied Stinger missiles to shoot down Soviet helicopters, taught guerrilla tactics, and built a vast network of covert supply lines. The Soviets were eventually forced to withdraw, a humiliating defeat that contributed to the collapse of their empire. But there was a dark side. Many of those Mujahideen fighters would later form the backbone of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Proof that in the world of intelligence, today's allies can become tomorrow's enemies. At the same time, the CIA was embroiled in one of the biggest scandals in its history, the Iran-Contra affair. Congress had banned military aid to Nicaragua's Contra rebels, who were fighting the socialist Sandinista government. But the Reagan administration, determined to support them, turned to the CIA for help. The solution was as bold as it was illegal. Secretly sell weapons to Iran, a sworn enemy, and use the profits to fund the Contras. The scheme blew up when a cargo plane carrying weapons was shot down. Investigations revealed a web of lies, cover-ups, and violations of U.S. law. Several officials were indicted. Some went to prison. Most were pardoned. And once again, the CIA walked away bruised but intact. Even with scandals swirling, the agency was still pulling off incredible feats of espionage. One of the most daring was Project Azorian. In 1974, the Soviets lost a nuclear submarine deep in the Pacific Ocean. The CIA saw an opportunity. They built a massive ship disguised as a mining vessel, the Glomar Explorer, and used it to secretly lift the submarine from the ocean floor, all under the cover of a commercial operation. When reporters discovered the plan, the agency responded with a now famous phrase, "We can neither confirm nor deny." That statement, the Glomar response, became a cornerstone of intelligence language. By the mid-1980s, the CIA was operating on a global scale that would have been unimaginable 30 years earlier. They had toppled governments, manipulated elections, assassinated enemies, armed guerrillas, built spy satellites, run secret wars, and shaped the course of the Cold War, often without a single shot fired by a U.S. soldier. They were no longer just an intelligence agency. They were a tool of empire. But as the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of collapse, the world and the CIA were about to change again. The old enemy was dying. New ones were rising. And in the chaos of the post-Cold War era, the agency would have to reinvent itself all over again. By the mid-1980s, the CIA had become more than just an intelligence agency. It was a geopolitical engine. Presidents came and went, but the agency endured. It had toppled governments, created proxy armies, sabotaged industries, and manipulated global opinion. But now, its greatest enemy, the Soviet Union, was starting to fall apart. And with that collapse came a new question. What happens to the world's most powerful spy agency when its reason for existing disappears? The answer: it evolves. The late 1980s were a period of transition. The Soviet Empire was cracking. Communist governments in Eastern Europe were collapsing. And by 1991, the Cold War was officially over. The CIA had spent nearly half a century focused on one enemy, and now that enemy was gone. Inside Langley, analysts scrambled to redefine the mission. Some believed the agency should focus on emerging regional threats, rogue states, terrorist groups, drug cartels. Others argued for a shift toward economic and technological intelligence, keeping tabs on rivals like Japan and rising powers like China. The truth? They had to do all of it. One of the CIA's new battlegrounds was the war on drugs. Latin America became a major focus as powerful cartels rose in Colombia and Mexico. The agency worked with the DEA and foreign governments to track cartel leaders, intercept shipments, and dismantle trafficking networks. But these operations were messy and controversial. In some cases, the CIA was accused of turning a blind eye to drug trafficking by anti-communist allies. In others, they were accused of being directly involved. The murky line between intelligence gathering and complicity blurred again. Meanwhile, the fall of the USSR didn't mean the end of espionage. It just meant new players entered the game. Russia's new intelligence service, the FSB, continued many of the KGB's missions. China's Ministry of State Security began expanding its global influence. And rogue nations like North Korea and Iran became priority targets. The CIA had to learn new languages, literally and figuratively. The old playbook of coups and Cold War proxy wars was evolving into something more fluid, more decentralized, and far more unpredictable. One of the agency's biggest concerns in the 1990s was the rise of non-state actors, organizations that weren't governments but still posed massive threats. Chief among them was a name most people had never heard before: Al-Qaeda. It started in the mountains of Afghanistan during the Soviet War. The CIA's Operation Cyclone had armed and trained thousands of Mujahideen fighters, many of whom saw themselves as holy warriors. When the Soviets left, some of those fighters turned their attention elsewhere, toward the infidel West. One of them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He and his followers built Al-Qaeda into a global jihadist network, recruiting fighters, raising money, and planning attacks on U.S. interests worldwide. The first major warning came in 1993, when a truck bomb exploded beneath the World Trade Center in New York. 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured. It was a wake-up call, but not enough. In 1998, al-Qaeda bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224 people. In 2000, they struck again, this time attacking the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 sailors. Each attack was bigger, bolder, and more coordinated. And while the CIA tracked bin Laden's movements, they struggled to stop him. There were bureaucratic battles with the FBI, intelligence failures, missed opportunities, and then came September 11, 2001, the day that changed everything. 9/11 and the transformation of the CIA was 8:46 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., a third plane struck the Pentagon. A fourth, United Flight 93, crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people died. The most powerful country in the world had been struck on its own soil, and the CIA, despite years of warnings, had failed to stop it. Inside Langley, the mood shifted overnight. The mission wasn't about containment anymore, it was about preemption. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, and the CIA became the spearhead. Within weeks, CIA teams were on the ground in Afghanistan. They weren't wearing uniforms. They weren't driving tanks. They were riding horses with Northern Alliance fighters, calling in airstrikes on Taliban positions, and hunting al-Qaeda leaders in the mountains of Tora Bora. Operation Jawbreaker, as it was known, marked a new era of covert war. Small, agile teams working deep behind enemy lines, often with little oversight and zero official acknowledgement. But this new era also had a darker side. The agency began capturing suspected terrorists around the world and sending them to black sites, secret prisons in countries where interrogation laws were, let's say, more flexible. Detainees were subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques, a euphemism for torture, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions. Critics called it a betrayal of American values. The CIA called it necessary. The debate still rages to this day. They also launched extraordinary renditions, grabbing suspects off the streets, often without charges, and flying them to countries like Egypt, Poland, or Thailand for questioning. Some of those suspects were guilty, others were innocent. The collateral damage didn't matter, not in those early, fearful years. Then there was the drone war. If the 20th century was defined by spies in trench coats, the 21st was defined by operators behind screens. Armed drones became the CIA's weapon of choice, capable of loitering over a target for days and striking with deadly precision. In places like Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia, suspected militants were killed by the thousands, often without warning, trial, or public acknowledgement. The strikes decimated al-Qaeda's leadership but also killed hundreds of civilians. For many, the sound of drones buzzing overhead became the soundtrack of the war on terror. One of the CIA's most significant victories came in 2011. After a decade-long manhunt, they tracked Osama bin Laden to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. On May 2nd, U.S. Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 6 raided the compound and killed him. The operation was a triumph of intelligence work. Years of signals intercepts, informants, surveillance, and relentless pursuit. But even with bin Laden dead, the war was far from over. The digital turn, cyber operations, and influence as the dust settled from 9/11. The CIA faced another challenge. The world was going digital. Battles weren't just happening on battlefields anymore. They were happening online. And the agency had to adapt. The first major shift was cyber espionage. Hacking wasn't just a criminal activity anymore. It was a weapon. The CIA built specialized units to infiltrate foreign networks, steal classified data, sabotage infrastructure, and monitor digital communications. One of the most significant, and still partly classified, hidden operations was Stuxnet, a joint U.S.-Israeli cyber weapon that sabotaged Iran's nuclear centrifuges without a single bomb being dropped. It marked the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one fought with code instead of bullets. Then came Vault 7. In 2017, WikiLeaks published nearly 9,000 CIA documents revealing their cyber arsenal, tools capable of hacking smartphones, smart TVs, and even vehicles. The leaks showed just how far the agency's digital reach had extended, and just how vulnerable the modern world had become. But hacking was just one side of the coin. The other was influence. The CIA had been manipulating narratives for decades, but the rise of social media turned that art into a science. Fake accounts, bots, and targeted disinformation campaigns became powerful tools for shaping public opinion. Sometimes the goal was to destabilize an adversary. Other times it was to build support for U.S. policies abroad. In the digital age, perception wasn't just part of the battle. It was the battle. One of the CIA's most ambitious psychological operations involved Syria during its civil war. The agency not only armed and trained rebel groups but also seeded online narratives designed to delegitimize the Assad regime and undermine Russian influence. They created fake news sites, fabricated documents, and flooded social media with propaganda. Most people consuming that information had no idea it originated from Langley, and that's exactly how the CIA wanted it. New frontiers, biotech, AI, and the human domain by the early 2000s. The CIA's operations had expanded far beyond traditional intelligence. They weren't just collecting secrets anymore. They were venturing into the realms of biology, data science, and artificial intelligence. One emerging battlefield was biotechnology. With advances in genomics and bioengineering, DNA had become a new form of intelligence and a new vulnerability. The agency began monitoring foreign biotech research, concerned that adversaries might develop genetically targeted weapons. They also started exploring ways to use biological data for identification and surveillance. Tracking individuals through microscopic traces left behind at crime scenes or on everyday objects. Artificial intelligence became another key frontier. The volume of data collected by the CIA, from satellite imagery to intercepted communications, had grown so massive that human analysts couldn't process it all. Enter machine learning. AI systems could now analyze patterns across petabytes of data, flagging potential threats before they materialized. Some systems, according to leaked documents, were even capable of predicting political unrest based on social media trends and economic indicators. All right, let's be real for a second. By the time we reach the modern day, the CIA isn't the same agency it was in the Cold War. It's not just spies and trench coats, not just coups and coded messages anymore. It's bigger, smarter, quieter, and, honestly, a whole lot scarier. If the first half of this story was about power, this part is about control. And not control of armies or governments. I'm talking about control of information, biology, and even reality itself. See, the battlefields today are not countries. They're servers, social networks, and genomes. The wars aren't fought with bullets. They're fought with algorithms, narratives, and code. And the CIA? They've adapted perfectly. The DNA revolution. Let's start with something most people don't think about. Your DNA. Yeah, that tiny blueprint inside you? It's more valuable than gold now. And for intelligence agencies, it's a map. One that tells them who you are, where you came from, and even what diseases you might develop. Around 2016, the CIA began taking biotechnology seriously. They realized genetic data could become a tool for tracking people, identifying targets, or even designing weapons tailored to specific groups. It's not sci-fi. If an agent leaves a coffee cup in a hotel room, a small DNA trace could confirm their identity. Some analysts believe the agency already uses genetic material for surveillance in ways we can't even imagine. And on the darker side, scientists have warned about targeted bioweapons. Viruses that exploit genetic vulnerabilities in specific populations. It's the kind of thing that once belonged in a spy thriller, and now it's discussed in defense briefings. AI. Predicting the future, but the real game changer isn't DNA. It's AI. There's simply too much information in the world for humans to process. Billions of messages, hours of video, social media posts, financial transactions, satellite images. So the CIA turned to machine learning. Modern intelligence doesn't just analyze threats, it predicts them. AI can flag a protest before it starts by watching online chatter. It can anticipate a coup by linking food shortages with troop movements. It can even predict the spread of misinformation before it goes viral. Rumors talk about a system called Sentient, an AI that connects data from space, internet traffic, and economic signals to forecast global events. Whether it's real or not, one thing's certain. The CIA isn't just reacting to the future anymore. It's trying to shape it. Reality manipulation, influence. 2.0 and shaping the future isn't limited to predictions. It's also about controlling the narrative. Remember when propaganda meant leaflets or radio broadcasts? That's ancient history. Today, influence operations happen invisibly, inside your feed, your group chats, and your trending hashtags. Instead of planting stories in newspapers, agencies now seed them through armies of fake accounts. They don't have to lie. They just amplify certain truths, bury others, and twist how events are perceived. And if they do their job well, no one ever realizes the narrative was engineered in the first place. This is how elections are nudged without ballots ever being touched. How protests are accelerated or diffused without a single soldier deployed. And how entire societies can be pushed in one direction without anyone suspecting a foreign hand is behind it. Corporate battlegrounds. And while all this is happening online, another war is raging in boardrooms. The CIA knows that whoever controls semiconductors, AI chips, quantum computing, and telecom infrastructure controls the future. So corporate espionage has become just as vital as traditional spying. Intelligence operations now involve sabotaging competitors, leaking scandals, and influencing trade policies, all while never appearing in the headlines. If a foreign company suddenly collapses before sealing a big defense deal, or a major merger mysteriously falls apart, don't be surprised if an intelligence agency was involved somewhere in the shadows. Deepfakes, false flags, and the battle for truth. And here's where things get really unsettling: the rise of deepfakes and synthetic media. We now live in a world where videos and audio can be fabricated so convincingly that reality itself is up for debate. A fake video of a president declaring war, a forged audio of a general planning a coup, a falsified manifesto leaked online. All of these could start wars, tank markets, or bring down governments, and no one would know if they were real. Intelligence agencies are both terrified of this power and quietly experimenting with it. False flag cyber attacks disguised as foreign operations, already happening. Deepfake disinformation campaigns, underway. The war for truth itself is the next great front, and it's one where victory might mean rewriting reality altogether. The black budget and private power, and none of it is cheap. The CIA's black budget, believed to exceed $15 billion, funds projects that don't officially exist. Private contractors, shell companies, university labs, startup partnerships, they all feed into this massive hidden ecosystem of intelligence work. Many technologies that define our lives today, from satellite mapping to facial recognition, were born in this secret world long before they reached the public. This blending of public and private power isn't just strategy, it's insulation. It keeps operations off the books and out of reach. It makes sure the agency can keep pulling levers, even when no one knows those levers exist. What comes next? Where does it all go from here? If the past 80 years have taught us anything, it's that the CIA's evolution never stops. It's already moving toward AI-driven espionage, where missions plan and execute themselves; genetic-level surveillance, where identity can't be hidden; not even in your DNA. Preemptive geopolitics, where conflicts are shaped before they begin. Reality warfare, where the truth is the most contested weapon on the planet. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Because the next great battles might not be visible at all. They won't be fought in deserts or cities, but in servers, genomes, and ideas. And most people will never even know they happened. Final thought, the ghost still moves, so here we are. From the coups in Iran and Guatemala, to black sites and drones, to AI algorithms predicting revolutions before they happen. The story of the CIA is the story of power without a face. It's a story of how a nation learned to shape the world without ever raising a flag. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a government falls overnight, or a viral video changes public opinion, or a company you've never heard of suddenly dominates a global industry, you'll stop and ask, was that just history unfolding? Or was that the invisible hand of the CIA